Hi, welcome to this afternoon. And this is part of a three-part series exploring the value of asking essential questions as a framework for learning in the classroom, in the museum. And we've a great group of team here to really represent some different perspectives and voices. My name is Claire Moore, and I work here at the Metropolitan Museum of Art with teacher programs. And I'm just going to take a moment here at the start to walk you through what to expect during our hour together. So during the hour together, we will start with just some introductions of the various presenters. Have a talk by Jay McTighe, really exploring what essentials are, how you'd know one. And then we'll take a look at the various applications in visual arts and social studies through a conversation with our colleagues Susan Griffin from the National Council for Social Studies and Dennis Inhulsen, past president for NAEA. So I'm going to go ahead and turn things over Jay, and I'll get your slides right up, Jay. So if you want to say a quick hello while I get you started.
Hello and good afternoon, unless you're in Hawaii. So aloha, good morning. We're happy to be with you, and I'm leading off the webinar with a look at the idea of essential questions. Some of you know that Grant Wiggins and I wrote a book on this topic, and there's the cover on the screen. Let me begin by acknowledging, of course, that there are different types of questions. Next slide, please. And briefly speaking, we could identify questions that we might call leading, and you hopefully see the slide with an example for a unit on nutrition. What are the names of the four food groups? The leading question typically directs students toward a given objective, typically a correct answer, and it's generally leading toward knowledge that you want students to acquire. The second type of question is a little more open, and often these are called guiding questions. For example, what do we mean by a balanced diet? It's meant to guide kids in exploring an idea or a concept or a process, but there's still a pretty correct answer. You could Google and find it. It's not particularly open-ended. Another type of question that is certainly valuable and thought-provoking can be thought of as a hook. And for an example of a unit on nutrition, the question, can what you eat help prevent this, is often likely to engage young people. I call this a hook question because typically a hook is used at the beginning of a new unit of study, or it might be a hook for a given lesson. But the hook question is meant to engage and provoke in a good way, but it's not a question you come back to again and again. And that differentiates those first three from essential questions. An essential question is more open-ended. It typically doesn't have a single correct answer, and it's a question that we can come back to again and again. Claire, I seem to have lost the screen here for a moment, so I don't know if everyone else is.
Oh, great. We've got the slide up. What's an essential question?
Okay. I've lost the visual for some reason, so I'm going to do my best to navigate through. So what I want to explore now is the question, what makes a question essential? And take a closer look at the characteristics of those. What I prepared are 2 slides, each containing 6 questions in 2 columns. And if you could go to slide 4, Claire. I'm going to ask the viewers to look at the two columns. The three on the left are questions that I would call essential. The three on the right are not, in my view, essential questions, even though they're topically linked. Take a moment to compare the two sets and think what distinguishes the essential questions on the left side from those on the right. And if you could advance to the next slide, you'll see 6 more questions also in 2 groups. And do the same. Compare the two and see what distinguishes the ones from the left, the essential questions, from those on the right. So let me summarize what I would propose are some of the key characteristics that should be hopefully evident in the comparison. Next slide shows what to me are the essential characteristics of essential questions. And I'll go from the upper left around the wheel. One characteristic, of course, is that essential questions are open-ended in nature. That is, they typically don't have a single correct answer or a single way of approaching the question. These are questions that require reasoning, not just recall. But the more you know, the better you'll be able to think and reason. Essential questions, in my view, also require support by the learner. You don't just want an answer. You want them to give you their thinking, their reasoning, their justification, their explanation. A second characteristic, the upper right, good essential questions are engaging intellectually. A friend of mine likes to comment that a good question is like an itch. You want to scratch it. And so the best questions get under your skin. They make you go, like the old Arsenio Hall show. A third characteristic, an important one, good essential questions spark other questions. They are used to drive inquiry, and they are used to generate other fruitful questions, both by the teacher and ideally, and over time, we would like to see questions coming from the student. I like to say that you know your essential questions are working when kids start popcorning or popping questions off of your question. That's a great sign. And finally and importantly, the fourth characteristic on the bottom left, good essential questions can and should recur. If it's an essential question, it's not a question that you ask once and then you're done with because you've answered it. Quite the opposite. These are questions that you come back to again and again. And in revisiting the question, the hope is that you will go deeper and that you will develop greater insight, deeper understanding, and maybe even change your initial understanding when first considered. So those are characteristics that we ascribe to such questions. Next slide, please. In the book that Grant Wiggins and I have written, in the whole series, Understanding by Design, we have a maxim that we think applies, and it applies to essential questions. If you look to the next slide, our maxim or our mantra is that understanding must be earned. It must be earned by the learner. Coming to an understanding, the very phrase suggests that it's not something that you necessarily get right away. Come to an understanding means it occurs over time, and it occurs ultimately in the mind of the learner. The learner has to actively construct or make meaning to come to understand. Accordingly, then, the teacher's role is not simply telling, but engaging student meaning making. And that, of course, is one of the important roles of an essential question. My recommendation is we lead with the question. We don't give away the understandings. That's what kids must earn. and they earn it by actively making meaning. So I'd like to now take a finer-grained look at types of essential questions, and the next slide is provides a visual of that notion. And the next slide as well. I found it useful to think within any discipline area, be it social studies, the arts, mathematics, science, ELA, to recognize that, like the DNA strand, there are in fact two strands typically at play. There's the content of the discipline, framed around areas like geography, civics, history, economics, and there are the processes of the disciplines, the creative processes of the arts, critical thinking, research, and so forth. And so if we think about our disciplines through the two strands, it suggests that we also would develop and use essential questions for both. Those of you familiar with the mathematics ELA, Common Core, pardon me, or the next generation science standards, know that those standards are very explicit about identifying their, quote, practices. And the practices are process standards. In the same way, the C3 Social Studies has done a wonderful job identifying their practices or ways of thinking in history, social studies, and the arts have a similar set of processes. So let us take a look briefly at examples of essential questions in both strands. The next slide has examples for science, I believe. And so the next generation science has a set of cross-cutting concepts that are related to science content. One of them is structure function, and the understanding about it is specified. We can use the understanding of the content, or the content understanding, to generate essential questions. How are structure and function related in living things and non-living things? And even though this is a science standard, I hope you could see that those questions could easily be ported into the arts in certain ways and in social studies in some contexts as well. Next slide, please. And here is an example again from science of one of the 8 practices, the idea of engaging in argument from evidence. That's a process standard. And interestingly, it's found not only in science, but it's found in ELA, in mathematics, and in social studies. And look at the essential questions generated from that practice or process standard. What makes a credible argument? What constitutes effective evidence? And these are questions that could be used not only in science, but in other subjects. Next slide. So here are 2 examples, one for social studies and one for the arts, of essential questions that are more content-based on the left and more process or practice-oriented on the right. And the next slide shows similar examples for the arts. So this is a nuance that I think is important. As you think about both developing and using essential questions, about developing and using them for both strands in the subject areas and the disciplines in which you teach. I'm going to wrap up my part of this webinar with some ideas for how we might develop essential questions. And I'd like to look at the next slide, which suggests a process of unpacking standards. So next slide shows a very short example of a process that can be used. The idea of unpacking is not new, and the way that I recommend doing that is to look at both the content and the process or practices standards particularly the big ones. Not necessarily every single grade level standard, but the bigger ones like anchor standards and the practice standards. And then the next page shows the process. Next slide, sorry. So here's a straightforward process. If you look at the big standards in your discipline, both process and content, highlight with a colored highlighter the nouns. And if the nouns are conceptual as opposed to just facts, those nouns can be used to identify, or they do identify, the quote big ideas that we want students to understand. And from those we can derive essential questions. And the verbs in the standard, if those standards are well written, are suggestive of needed assessments. So we're not going to focus on the assessments right now, but let me show you a quick example before I wrap up of this kind of unpacking. And I'm going to do it with one of the English language arts anchor standards. This is one of their big ones. So have a look at the standard. And I've highlighted in red the nouns. So this standard suggests that we want to help kids understand the nature of argument, not that people don't like each other and are fighting, but the nature of an intellectual argument. A part of that is to understand the claim and the role of a claim in formulating an argument. We also explore the idea of reasoning that supports an argument and the importance of evidence. These are nouns, these are conceptual, these are the basis for understandings that we want kids to earn, and they can be the basis then for essential questions. And the green are the verbs, which I'm not going to get into right now. So let's look at the next slide with some sample questions derived right from this standard. So this is a straightforward process that can be used to help unpack standards, help teachers really understand what the standard is calling for, and when the nouns are conceptual, not just factual, you can use those as a basis for generating essential questions. Okay, I'm going to wrap up with a couple of practical tips, and I'll direct you to the next slide, where those are noted. So we can use essential questions to organize and frame a unit of study. I generally don't recommend coming up with a new essential question for every single lesson. If it's an essential question, it's one that you want to explore over time, not once. So we propose framing essential questions for units of study, for an entire year or course, and in some cases, you can use essential questions that are overarching to frame an entire program. The next bullet, less is more, is also recommended. The goal is not to try to come up with as many essential questions as you can for a unit. Rather, a few good ones are all we need, like the Marine Corps recruiting motto. Our goal is to engage students in our questions. Sometimes, in fact, we come up with intellectually rich, open, thought-provoking questions that are worded for adults because we're the adults and we write them. But in some cases, especially with younger children, we may need to edit them to make them kid-friendly. So let's always keep our audience in mind. The final two tips are, I think, straightforward, and I'm going to show you 3 examples before I conclude. But posting the questions in the room, making them visible and keeping them up for the whole unit, if not the whole year, is a reminder to everyone that this is a classroom where we're uncovering the content, where we're exploring important ideas, where we're earning understanding, where inquiry is an important goal. And then inviting student questions always is a part of an inquiry-based classroom. Let me leave you with just 3 pictures from classrooms. Claire, you could scroll ahead, where such essential questions are posted. And here's the first one I want you to see for the arts. And the next. Here's a social studies unit around celebrations. What do we celebrate, and why do we celebrate? How do we celebrate, and how are celebrations similar and different? This is, I believe, a third grade unit. The last example I have is from a theater teacher hanging from mobiles in his black box room. Next one. And this was a beautiful display because he had these hanging from mobiles in his black box room, which is a very tall, had very tall ceilings. And so they were hanging above where the kids sat. And the currents of air in the room had the mobiles moving ever so slightly, but they were constantly moving. And the theater teacher said he did that metaphorically to convey the idea that these are questions that are always with us as artists, but also that these questions are alive, and as we explore them, our thinking may evolve and change, and our understandings will deepen. So those are three examples. Post your questions. And the last part of my session here is going to be a website that Grant Wiggins and I have set up, and the next slide will give you the URL. And it's simply essentialquestions.org. On this website, we have a number of sample essential questions from different subjects. We have some great videos, both of classrooms where essential questions are being used and teachers reflecting on them. We have a number of websites that give you resources, and a cool feature called the EQ Exchange, where we invite people to submit essential questions in exchange for the questions of others. And we have a database where you can search on submitted questions. So I hope this was interesting and useful to you, and I'm going to turn this back to Claire and our other webinar panelists right now.
Thanks so much, Jay, for walking us through really what is an essential question, why might we use them, and what are examples and some things to keep in mind as we create those questions. So we're going to really build on that foundation that you provided and give some thought to what this might look like in social studies or visual arts. And as I mentioned at the start of the session, we've got two fantastic speakers here to speak to those different perspectives. So one of those speakers is Dennis Inhulsen, past president of the National Art Education Association, and then our panelist is from the National Council for Social Studies. And so we have a couple of questions that they'll each speak to. So I'll go ahead and act as moderator for those questions and turn things over to them. So the first question that caught my attention was thinking about, I'd noticed in the National Coalition for Core Art Standards, the new standards, I saw that was really engaging and emphasizing inquiry-driven learning, actually essential questions that are embedded within those. And I also noticed the college, career, and civic life, the C3 framework, as it's otherwise known, for social standards also has a large emphasis on inquiry. And so I'd love to hear a little bit more about why you feel this approach is so important to student learning.
Well, I can go ahead.
We'll go ahead.
We can go back and anyway, thanks, Claire, for having us. This is great. You know, just about any researcher in quality instruction will include inquiry-based learning in the process. The conditions and the culture of classrooms, when we strive to develop really great learning experiences for kids, happen within an inquiry-based environment, a safe place for students to ask questions and for teachers to ask them. So it was easy in the visual arts, anyway, in all of the arts, to take that leap with posting standards along with essential questions. And I might add that they're sort of question starters. They're just the beginning. They're just a taste of what teachers and their students can and should do within those environments. So we are proponents of inquiry-based learning because really excellent teaching really gets students to think and to ask their own questions. And so that was an easy one. And we use Jay and Grant's work in the visual arts as the beginning. And you'll notice on the slide we have anchor standards, those bigger ideas, along with enduring understandings. But what we did was we gave our participants, people who are using standards, some essential questions, only 3, that would run across the learning progression. So if we think of the youngest child, preschooler, what are some questions, like Jay was saying, what are some questions that we can do and pose that are really age appropriate? And are those the same questions with different levels of sophistication as students grow in their learning, all the way through the adult learner, the lifelong learner? So the illustration gives us those enduring understandings with essential questions, those starters. I have to emphasize that those are just the beginning. We would really prefer that teachers learn to write their own questions, as Jay was helping us with. And then for us, the performance standards are grade by grade, and then the high school proficiency standards. In our processes in the visual arts, we're creating, presenting, responding, and connecting. And I have to do a shout out to presenting, as it comes from museums, and really helping students understand how work is shared in the world. And then we're also adding a component of assessments. So if we can just really look at that essential question piece, and I'll just share a quick story. So I was with my young adult daughter in LA a few years ago, and I think this will help. So we were walking in the Contemporary Museum in LA, and it was Banksy, the work of the graffiti artist, the anonymous, very famous graffiti artist. And she was raised in the arts, but we were walking around. She's not involved in the arts as a profession, and she said one thing to me that really stuck in terms of an essential question. And she said, "Isn't it a little weird, Dad, how all of this art that originally in its context, in its place, was not in a museum, and how they would take the work of a graffiti artist, slice it up, and place it in a museum with learning statements and little descriptions of what the art was." And I thought that was a really good question, because that's a question I could ask a 4-year-old. If a 4-year-old were to look at Banksy's art in context, in a community, what would they say versus what would they say when it's in a very fancy museum? So if you take that sort of that root question, you know, how is art displayed or shared throughout the world, presented, and how is it different in different communities? So we thought those kinds of questions to provide teachers with that starter, that beginning, was really, really important. And of course, we'd prefer that those teachers write their own questions over time. And how would they go about that? I would say that teachers would have to ask their own questions. Ask as many questions as possible, and then reach out to those big ideas, those really thought-provoking questions. And so this is the framework for our standards, and this is why we included the enduring understandings and the essential questions, is to promote that kind of thinking, that deep inquiry thinking that would work for our youngest children and our oldest children, all the way through a lifelong learner. So I hope I've answered a couple of those questions, and I can come back later, but just to provide an overview of our approach. Thank you.
Thank you so much, and we'll turn it over to Susan to get another perspective.
The C3 framework recognizes how important inquiry is to engaging students. So if you begin with a question, you are asking your students to start thinking right away. And you also spark their curiosity. So it's quite a shift in the way social studies content maybe has been more historically presented. You provided students with content that answered questions, okay? But you start with a question like an essential question that could have many different kinds of answers. Sparks the curiosity of the student and really engages them in a process of investigation. There was a phrase that I saw in Jay's book about, if they call it interrogating the content. I thought that was brilliant, because instead of feeding content to students, ask them to interrogate the content, and that's at the core of the C3 framework. I'd like to talk a little bit about how the C3 framework came about, because believe it or not, C3 framework is not a household word. So the College Career and Civic Life Framework, we're asking states and school districts to use it as they try to encourage more rigor in their social studies standards and in their instruction. So if this was not something that NCSS cooked up on our own. We had help from 22 states and 14 other professional organizations. The LA County Office of Education was involved, the University of Delaware. We had many teachers involved at each iteration. I think in the next slide shows all the different people or organizations and entities that were involved. So every time we had an iteration of the standards, we sent it out to these 50 teachers who were a collaboration of elementary, middle school, and high school teachers, and they were extremely generous with their comments. So we learned a lot from their comments, and it really made, obviously, the document much more rich and with its feet firmly in reality. So we appreciated that. The objectives of the C3 framework on the next slide: to enhance the rigor of social studies disciplines, critical thinking, problem solving, and participatory skills to become engaged citizens. We have been a little frustrated in the social studies community because we've talked a lot about college and career readiness. Well, we believe that the civic mission of schools is also central, and that the critical thinking, problem solving, and participatory skills are essential for success in college and career, but they really prepare all students for their role as citizens. The C3 framework also aligned the content to the Common Core State Standards for English Language Arts. This was a decision that was a little challenging, because that for the last few years, social studies teachers have been directed to be sure to be including the Common Core Standards, and it wasn't a choice they were making, and they weren't necessarily comfortable doing that. So we were very deliberate about making sure that we would show what the intersections were between the Common Core Standards and the C3 framework, so that they would really be mutually beneficial. The foundations of the framework are on the next slide, and the inquiry arc is at the center. So this question is really important because it starts off the whole approach to teaching social studies in this way. The disciplinary literacy, it's not that we've done away with content and just gone to process, no. The disciplines are really integral to social studies, of course. So the different representatives, the writers from the different disciplines, insisted that there be disciplinary integrity as well as interdisciplinarity, so that students could understand that if you're trying to understand a historical event, you will often need to understand the geographic context as well as economics. The civic life, of course, is a pillar of social studies as we've seen it, and it's really important to NCSS that is a central part of K-12 education. The next slide shows the inquiry arc. So we start with a question and plan the inquiry. You look to the disciplines, the concepts and tools. We talked about how it's important for each of our disciplines to be able to develop skills and tools that will help us explore the discipline we're interested in. So once we have the content, we need to evaluate and show how we'll use the evidence to answer the question in a compelling way. And finally, we communicate our conclusions and take informed action, because we are challenged to apply the knowledge that we've just investigated in practical ways in real life issues. So this requires instructional shifts, and they're in the next slide. So we say that inquiry is at the center, that there has to be disciplinary integrity and interdisciplinarity, and informed action and application of knowledge is essential. And this is on the next slide, Claire. So when you arrange your teaching in this way, it really does shift your instruction. And although some teachers have been doing this for quite a long time, we think it's important to get everybody on board, because it's really difficult when you're asking children or grandchildren or people at a high school where I help out from time to time, what their favorite subject is and what their least favorite subject is, and often they'll sadly say, I hate social studies. And that is very disturbing, of course, but I think that the reason that so many students are not engaged by it is that we have not pulled them into it. So by putting inquiry at the center, we pull them into it and ask them to investigate content. We also realize that with inquiry at the center, in the next slide, that we have turned the focus away from the teacher and put it back to the learner. So it's the intersection of the ideas and the learner. We're bringing those two things together. And we believe that approaching it this way really helps to direct students to apply the knowledge that we're providing and that they're finding for themselves. So let's look at what our questions. In the next slide, we talk about compelling and supporting questions. A very interesting alignment. I think all of the writers must have been reading Jay's books for years, because we say that compelling questions focus on real social problems, issues, and curiosities about how the world works. They should be intellectually meaty and kid-friendly. So, you look at a compelling question: was the American Revolution revolutionary? Why do we need rules in an elementary classroom? So these are questions, as Jay pointed out, that don't have one answer. And you really have to look at the question from a variety of perspectives in order to answer it. In the next slide, we have the compelling and supporting questions. So the supporting questions will help the students. They'll be the facts and the context that help the students answer the questions. So if you're looking at the civil rights movement and whether it was a success or not, you're also going to have to look at what kind of legislation was passed during the civil rights movement that changed the context of race in the U.S. So these laws supported a movement that really changed history. And then finally, the inquiry arc represents, in the next slide, a way of looking at instruction differently. And this is the core of the C3 framework, because we're asking students to engage with content, to ask really important questions and to think about what particular disciplines are going to help them answer it. They have to show that what they're saying when they answer the question is supported by evidence. And then they need to communicate effectively what their conclusion was, justifying it, and in some cases they will be taking informed action. The C3 framework is on the last slide, and it is available to download for free, socialstudies.org/C3. And there are other resources on that page that I think you might find helpful. So I encourage you to take a look at it and decide for yourself whether that might not be a more compelling way to engage with social studies content. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Susan. So I would love to glean just some tips you have for teachers who are considering making this shift towards inquiry-driven teaching, of really using a question as a framework for a unit of study or some extended period of time. What advice would you share with them? And this is really to of our speakers today.
Well, I have two ideas, and I'll share one now and one later. A simple but interesting way of generating such questions and moving more toward an inquiry approach is to think about if the content you teach represents answers, then what are the questions? So, for example, if we're teaching something about government, the U.S. government, we want students to know that there are three branches of government, there are two houses of Congress, we want them to learn how bills become laws and so forth. Well, if those are answers, if the content of the answers, what were the questions? And so in that example, you might say, well, the questions might be, how do we avoid abuse of power in government? How do we provide checks and balances? Because as the Federalist Papers note, no men/women are angels. The founding fathers and mothers knew that there's a human tendency when given power or when power is grabbed to overreach. And so they were looking to set up systems of government that would help to check that human tendency against abuse. If you frame the content around the questions, how do we avoid abuse of power? How do we provide checks and balances within a governmental system? Not only are you moving into exploring the answers, i.e. three branches of government, but you're also able to evaluate, well, how effective are three branches of government? Does this avoid abuse of power, or might it inevitably lead to gridlock? How are other nations attempting to avoid abuse of power? What are other government structures that might work, and so forth? It opens the door, in other words, rather than closes the door around unanswered.
Thanks so much, Jay. Any other tips? And as we were catching up, I saw you got bumped out of the Hangout for a bit. But we are just chatting of tips that we'd give teachers considering shift towards inquiry-driven teaching.
One of the things I think would be very important is to really get a grip on the notion of formulating essential questions, or we call them compelling questions. I mean, that if you start out with a really meaty question that engages the students, but it's not that easy. One of the things we've learned as we started to implement the C3 framework is that teachers can get stuck on that part of it, to find out how to craft a really compelling question. So I think that that would be a good place to start.
I would encourage teachers to start with their own questions and share those with the students and generate as many questions as possible from them, you know, like on a chart paper or an overhead or something, and then to craft those questions collectively in the beginning of an instructional unit, depending on the age and developmentally where they're at. I think it'd be very exciting for students to actually see with their teacher how to construct some of those questions in terms of the outcomes. What do they want to learn from that unit, from that experience?
Thanks, Dennis. And then just to one, we in the group, but I just wanted to know people who are tuning in, if there's been a question that while speakers have been presenting today, we'd love for you to add your questions as we wrap up here. Just feel free to type those in, and at the end of them we will have Q&A and follow up on those questions. So the last question I have for our facilitators here today is really thinking about, in practice, like kind of living either the life as a museum educator or a classroom educator, and just thinking about what are some of the challenges of applying this approach. What are some things to watch out for and to keep in mind?
One challenge that I think is ever present is the enormous amount of content, knowledge, and skills that are typically embedded in standards documents. I think the current round, or I'll call next generation standards in the arts, C3, Common Core, NGSS, and science, have done, I think, a commendable job trying to narrow the scope of and volume of content and be much more explicit about what Susan said and Dennis said, of focusing on inquiry and highlighting the fact that our job is to uncover the content, not to simply cover it. But I think that an impediment is the ever-present tension that teachers feel between the demands of the content and trying to cover it all, quote, and taking time to go deeper and to engage students more, involve students more in actually formulating questions and conducting inquiries. Let's face it, inquiry teaching is more time demanding than coverage. If our goal is to cover, then just talk faster in class. You'll get through it. But that's not our goal.
And I might add, Jay, that there's a level of risk-taking for classroom teachers. I'm an elementary principal for a long time, and that takes a fair amount of risk on the part of a teacher to go ahead and listen to those questions and post those questions and listen to those voices from those students about what they know or don't know or what they're thinking. And I, if I could wave a wand, I would just sort of take that burden off teachers and say, go for it. Have those conversations and listen. I think of the years I'd spend with packs of boys, usually boys, going up huge marble staircases in museums, and the simple question to them would be, why do they build these big places for art, for example? And for older students, it would be, how do they sustain these places, and how does it connect to their lives and their communities, etc. So, I would just hope teachers would feel empowered to think in terms of questions instead of just content all the time.
And I agree with you, Dennis. It does require a willingness to give up some control and to guide the students in their investigations, but to let them have at it. And that's not that easy to do if you're used to providing content instead of providing a way to have students investigate it.
Yeah, and I remember even I got lucky in one of my educations. One of my teachers, history teachers, said, we're not going to learn history, we're going to do history. That was an entirely different approach. I ended up teaching history for a while because of that man. He just, he was all about oral. This is 30 years ago. He was about oral history. He was about journaling. He was about listening and asking questions. It was project-centered, very much project-centered and presentation-based. And, still to this day, I think of that, and I thank him for that. And I think we just need to do more of that and listen to our students. It's what they want. They love it.
Absolutely.
We're in an age where we can, and students can Google much of the world's knowledge on a smartphone. And that has implications for how we teach. And I think it argues for opening and uncovering the content through more inquiry. Content knowledge is important, but it's not the end, not the end goal, arguably. I would propose for those who feel the stress of not being able to cover all the content or maybe uncomfortable giving away a bit of control, let's look at some data on this. And let's get away from just fixating on a once-a-year standardized test score snapshot as the data that we highlight. That's one picture. Let's look at a photo album of data. And one that Susan alluded to is one that I would recommend, or do recommend, that schools collect and look at very systematically, and that is, let's get evidence from students in terms of student surveys, in terms of interviews, in terms of activity of teacher inquiries, like shadow a student for a day and write a reflection on what your day was like in the life of a student. This is data as well. And my experience is that when you ask students, what was the most engaging thing you did last month or this school year, they're not going to say the worksheet or the test prep. They're going to talk about the inquiries, the projects, the problems, the creations, the controversies that were interesting to debate. So let's look at data from the most authentic source, student experience. And that will give us the courage, I believe, to do more of this without apology.
And how? That's awesome. Thank you. Today we had our state assessments. Third graders experiencing more than 3 hours. But concurrently, we had our second graders at a local nature center. And the smiles on those second graders coming into the building was a lot different than the smiles. They were still good third graders. They did their best. It's a lot different. And two boys were talking about whether or not snakes were poisonous in Michigan, right? They were all about that, you know. So I'm thinking that we're going down a better path when we give those kids those authentic experiences and listen to their questions and their ideas, exactly as Jay said and Susan. So yeah, still excited about it, but.
And now we have some really interesting ways to assess students, to get to Jay's point. There are a variety of things, including project-based learning, a program like National History Day, where there is a product at the end or an application of knowledge that's very visible. So we just have to transform the world of education and assessment.
I'll jump in with another point quickly as we are wrapping up. Many of you know, if you're at the high school level, that the College Board has been involved for the last couple of years in major course redesigns of advanced placement courses. And you may or may not know that they've been using Understanding by Design as a framework for that more recent course revision work, and essential questions are a big part of UBD. And so for those of you working in high school level, just know that all the things we're talking about in this webinar are right in line, not only with C3, Social Studies, and NCES, and Common Core, but the AP and the College Board is moving in this same direction. To be blunt, it's just no longer the case where a teacher can say, oh, I don't have time for inquiry because I have too much content and I'm teaching AP and we know it's loaded with content. Yes, it is, but read the course revisions and read the statements from the College Board. They are completely on board, pun intended, with what we're working about here.
Thank you so much. It looks like we have a question from one of our viewers. So Tom Hurd says, how comfortable are today's students struggling with big questions? Do students associate these questions with their classroom experiences?
I'll take a quick stab at this. Grant Wiggins, in our book on essential questions, have a whole chapter around how do we create a culture, a classroom culture that supports inquiry. And I think the question is a very important one, And it goes back to obstacle. I think that many students have come to believe that the game of school requires them to have the correct answer that the teacher wants and to hide their head and avert their eyes if they don't. And so shifting to an inquiry-based classroom and using essential and compelling questions can upend what students feel they know as the game of school. And I've met, including many gifted students, who are uncomfortable when challenged with open questions, especially some of the more able students and the high achievers, because they're used to winning the school game, which is being fast recallers. And so I think this approach demands cultivation of mindsets and reinforcing the fact that we're going to shift from teacher asks a question with a correct answer and your job is to try to figure it out, to a classroom where the teacher may not even know the answer to some of these. I think that takes time. It's a cultural shift, and we've got to help not only teachers but students get comfortable in that inquiry evolution.
Because it's preparing them for the jobs they're going to have. I mean, I spent a lot of my day answering questions or investigating maybe the best approach to appeal to a wider group of social studies teachers. So asking questions is really at the core of college career and civic life. And we have to also respect the questions that students have about the content they're reading. They have good questions. I mean, they're curious. And respecting their questions, I think, is a worthwhile place to start.
And I want to all of our facilitators here, it's been such a pleasure drawing from your experiences, really thinking deeply for those people who were viewing today and really interested in investing. Topic about a couple of upcoming opportunities we have to continue this conversation and take it further. So we have coming up on June 4th here at the Metropolitan Museum of Art an on-site day for teachers to really think about this conversation we've had today and the different ideas presented, and to start to imagine what this might look like in your practice, to come with a unit of study you're already teaching and working with, and to think how you might transform that into an inquiry-based investigation. We'll have that full day. And then we also have, for those people who are not in New York City or nearby, a follow-up on air. And we'll have voice from the field, so we'll have teachers, social studies teachers, visual arts teachers, even some museum talking about experience using us and compelling questions as a framework for an investigation over various arrays, and really giving concrete examples of some of the questions they've tried out, how that played out in their practice. So we hope to see you there, and the information is available at the website listed of the page. Thank you so much for joining us. And if you have other thoughts that you didn't share or comment during the session today, feel free to add ideas to the Google Plus event page, and it'll keep a tab there. And thank you so much again to our fantastic group, Dennis, Jay, and Susan. It's such a pleasure to work with you, and thank you again so much.
Thank you, Claire.
Goodbye, everyone.
Great. Bye. Take care.
Bye now. Thanks.